say certainly each piece or like, sets of the pieces they were a reflection point. I actually had in front of my screen at the time in my office, I had like a rolling 30 days of every single painting. So I would change them out every single day, and it gave me like this visual progress of what I was doing. And certainly times where I dealt with anger issues, times where I was maybe more depressive, times where I felt like I was more joyful, times, just kind of that roller coaster of emotion. And I could see that in the paintings, at least, when I was looking at them.
Hello, and welcome to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. This podcast is about exploring the grief that occurs at different times in our lives, in which we have had major changes and transitions that literally shake us to the core and make us experience grief. I created this podcast for people to feel a little less hopeless and alone in their own grief process as they hear the stories of others who have had similar journeys. I'm Kendra Rinaldi, your host. Now, let's dive right into today's episode. Thank you so much for choosing to listen to the podcast today. You will be hearing this conversation that I'm having with Preston Zeller today. He is an artist with accomplishments across various multiple mediums, including film, photography, music, and fine art. And today we will be talking particularly about how he used art in the process of grieving the passing of his brother who passed away in 2019. So I am excited to have this conversation. Welcome.
Hey,
Welcome.
Kendra, thanks for having
Hi,
me.
Preston. Thank you for being here. And we will be talking a lot about the upcoming documentary that you made called The Art of Grieving. Am I saying I'm not reading it at the moment, so I hope yeah, I did get it right. The Art of Grieving, which I think is a beautiful title because even if the documentary didn't have to do about art, just the title, there is an art in the process of grieving, even if
Mm,
it's not an actual medium. So it's just so perfect. What a perfect title. So welcome once again.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm looking
So
forward to chatting with you.
yes, and I was telling you we were just going to be talking just candidly and just about life a little bit, and we'll cover all the different aspects about you as well as your brother's passing and the grief. So tell us more about you first and your family, the family you grew up with, and then the family you chose as well, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. I grew up in California, in Southern California, and one of three kids, parents who, fortunately, they're still married, which is great. And I'm a middle child, so I grew up with an older brother, younger sister, and we were about 3, 4 years apart, each of us. But yeah, we had a pretty like I guess typical kind of middle class upbringing, and enjoyed going to the beach, played lots of sports, all that kind of stuff. And eventually, I went away to college and studied film production and that kind of stuff, and worked in the film industry. And I've been in the arts most of my life. And it's I started out doing kind of fine art esque stuff when I was, or just art classes, I guess you could say. When I was young, my mom's an artist, and so learned a lot of that from her. But it really manifested in the way of music for a long
Mm.
time. So I've been a musician for a long time as well. That's what I pursued for many years. And then, yeah, I went into film, yet another kind of like creative medium. And then I really got disenchanted with the music industry at some point and just completely got out of it. Went into more like a marketing field, and kind of continued to do film videography related stuff there. But in 2011, I want to say, met my wife, and we got married a year later. And yeah, had 3 kids pretty quickly, so they're all like 18 months apart. And moved to Washington State for a while, where my wife was from, and started raising kids there. And then yeah, that kind of led up to 2019, where my brother passed away, and a lot of things kind of changed from there as well. But um, yeah, so that's kind of the nutshell version.
The umbrella version of your family dynamics. My gosh, as you're talking, I always I ask people also like where they've lived, where they're from. I find it intriguing also when people move. I've moved, and I actually lived in every single state you have moved in so far. So
Oh
we
wow.
both, yeah, we both live in Texas right now. I went to college in California, and when I moved here from Colombia, I lived in Washington. So you're only missing two of
That's
my states,
funny.
You're missing Massachusetts and Georgia, and then we would have lived in all the same. Yeah, so those are the two extra
That's
states I've lived in.
I will say I never lived on the East Coast, but I had a pretty formidable experience in college where I studied abroad in France, and
Mm,
worked at the Cannes Film Festival and stuff there.
that's wonderful.
And so I was in Europe for like 5 months, got to go to 11 countries while I was there. And it was pretty scrappy. I just had a backpack, and I was going by myself on trains and whatnot. But I was, goodness, 19 at the time. Um, and then I
Oh,
worked at the film festival again the year later. But that was a lot of traveling in a short period of time. And, you know, really impactful year and ages of my life. And, someday I would like to get back to doing that again, probably post kids and stuff. But
mhm.
yeah, otherwise I was pretty much all West Coast until a couple years ago.
Until now, yeah, Texas. It is. Do you find it that there's a lot of growth that happens with travel, like with those kind of experiences, a lot of growth opportunities and those changes?
Oh, well, for sure. I mean, you're seeing, of course, different cultures, and even in the U.S., I think there's exposure to different cultures. But once you get into a different language, and places like, I mean, pretty much anywhere but the U.S. that
Mhm.
has really old roots, right? I was in Europe. I ventured over to Greece at some point, which you're kind of like, teetering on going in the Middle East, and just the history there is more like thousands of years old. And you just experience those cultures in such a different way. I learned French while I was there. That's part of the reason why I went there. So getting to like learn a different language and speak that language with people in that culture is also like, it's hugely gratifying and revealing about yourself, and what you learn about people. So I love it. I love
That's
traveling.
fun. That's awesome. No, thank you for sharing that. And I know that that sometimes people don't realize, even if you haven't moved anywhere in your life, like if you have lived where you were born,
Yeah.
you don't even see like how much there's a grief component even in those aspects of moving too. There's this shedding, leaving
Mm,
behind, and so forth as well, but then there's also then that growth that occurs in that discovering of either new cultures, new you have to find new a set of friendships every time you move
mhm,
somewhere. Sometimes people have to find a new church or a new, everything, right? A new job. If they've moved for a job, then they, it's a lot of change that happens in a move. So anyway, so I'm always curious about that, because I feel that even if we have not experienced grief in the terms of death, which both of us have, and actually I've also had a sister who passed away, so we share the loss of a sibling in common. um you have still experienced grief before that, just not
oh
in
yeah.
the shape of death. And therefore, you have some aspects of tools that you didn't even know you did have. Um, so anyway, so thank you for sharing that. Now let's
Yeah.
go into then your relationship with your brother Colin, and a little bit about the circumstances around his passing, how you
Yeah.
found out, and then how that completely shifted. And I know I'm I don't want to spoil your movie either because I want people to see it, but because they will find out more details. But if you don't mind sharing that as well, please.
Yeah, and something I don't get into like too far in the movie rabbit trail wise is like, nuances of our relationship, just because it
It's not if
was
and you don't have to if even for the podcast purposes, you don't have to. It's totally
no, I'm
up to
happy to
you.
talk about it. I mean, it's I don't get into it in the movie as much because it's not really a documentary about our relationship.
Mhm.
Which if it was, then there'd be a lot more there. But yeah, I mean, he was 4 years older than me, and uh, there is, it's funny. I realized this actually like 6 months ago. Um, I think when you have siblings, they impact these like early vows you make in life. And I had made one sort of about my brother. And, you make these vows because they are part of the early things that shape you, the early relationships that shape you. But one of them was, as my brother and I got older, my brother, we were just competitive. I would say it was always a little more lopsided. At least it felt like that. Him towards me, he wanted to make sure that he had, this thumb on me, and that he was gonna be
You're the middle child, right? Because your sister is the youngest of the 3 of you,
right,
correct? Yeah.
right, yeah. But as my brother got older and got into drugs and started in a more serious way, um, that was probably around like getting into college, 18, 19, 20. He tried to like loop me into some of his shenanigans, right? And I was probably pretty judgy of him at the time because I saw some of what he was doing, and it was just like, well, that's really gross to me. And
Mhm.
um, of course, he didn't like that. But I made this vow early in life that I was just gonna be better than him. I was going
Mm,
to be better in career, be better in family life, all this kind of stuff. So um, I had some innate desires there as well, but that was this like unconscious driving force for a while, and so I realized that that was part of the emptiness I had after he passed away, was that that vow no longer held anything, and I think people probably don't realize how much those vows exist, especially with parents too. I think at least one of your parents, uh, you're gonna be like, and it's oftentimes like if you're a woman, it's your mom. If it's your male, it's your dad. But you have this kind of thing where you want to maybe prove them wrong to some degree, or
mhm,
prove them right, whatever it is. But
mhm,
when that person passes away, you're like, I feel rudderless now. What is it?
mm,
And so that was one of those things where, as we got into adulthood and whatnot, it was like there are certain seasons in life where we are like really close, and mind you, we're both like building our families. He never had kids, but he was married for over 10 years. But you're building your families. We eventually lived in different states, and he was in the military, so he actually moved around quite a bit. That was a layer of complexity, right? You're coming home from he was in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so he's
mm.
coming home and has all sorts of really his own
Grief
forms
and
of grief
trauma.
there.
Yeah, grief and
Yeah,
trauma associated that and how the tools he used were just not the right ones per se, probably to cope with
yeah.
those emotions. Mm,
Yeah, I mean, he was certainly being medicated in a way that,
mhm,
and and even as after I made the documentary and reflecting on it, I'm like, I'm kind of like talking about his grief, but not directly. But that's what drugs are generally used for. You're like masking the need to address some kind of
mm,
deep down issue that you have, and of course, unfortunately, in military world, these people come back and they're a wreck, and they prescribe them a lot of medication. And of course, unfortunately, a lot of it's like fentanyl. related now. But so as adults, it kind of became hard to like share wins in life with him. He could be happy for me maybe sometimes. I had one really interesting experience actually on so in the beginning of the documentary, right, there's this like footage on a cruise ship, and that was the last time I hung out with him,
Oh, really?
which is partially why it's in there. And we didn't have much footage together, period. So that was really kind of funny that so I had a GoPro on that trip. He goes and buys a GoPro as well because I have one. He didn't ever use it, so it's from his perspective what's getting shot. But we're at dinner one night, and they have like a formal night on cruise ships, and so of course he didn't dress up for some reason. But my mom had this idea. She's like, let's go all around the table and say something nice about the person to your right. Well, I happen to be sitting on the right of my brother. And so when it came around to him, I was like, oh, what's he gonna say? Something really cynical, maybe, I don't know. But he said something really sincere, and he's like, I've always admired Preston's creativity, and I wish I had that, and I just don't. And then he kind of he elaborated on it more. I'm like, well, that was a really cool thing to say. So I know that if he could see all that I was doing, it would be like
Mm.
probably feed into his ego a lot, and just like, wow. But that was
A lot of
something he always
sibling
kind of
rivalry
looked
there.
up to
It's
me
funny
for.
because you didn't want to let him know how much that had moved you because you're like, well, I don't want to feed his ego, but it did move me. Yet
Yeah.
it's like, but Preston, as you're saying here, I'm like feeling really moved because that aspect of, especially when you have those dynamics and you're 4 years apart. I was 2 years apart from my sister. There's always the sibling rivalry, and as a sibling,
Mm-hmm.
you remember those things. Yet at the same time, sometimes when you're grieving, it's really hard to share very candidly that the when you're grieving the loss of anybody, regardless,
Mm-hmm.
we sometimes end up putting the memories on a pedestal of everything that was just so perfect. And we sometimes
Mm.
don't share the things that weren't. And so I want to first off acknowledge you for being so open of sharing about this dynamic that you have that is raw and real, because we tend to not do that because we feel as if we're disrespecting those that have passed, but it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
It's honoring the trueness of the relationship as well, and that is just what it was. And in amidst all that, there's still this constant love, right? Still, that doesn't mean
Mm-hmm.
that because there's all these intrinsic kind of little dynamics in a family that the love is not there. The love is always there. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
um yeah, go ahead. So then that was the part a little bit about then the dynamic. So tell us, you were working, where were you working at the time when you got, what kind of job? You said you had been into marketing when you got out, is
Yeah.
that correct? So how did you feel? And you were in that job, you get the phone call of your father, your brother's passing. This is what
Mm-hmm.
month of 2019? What month did he pass away?
February
February
2019. Yeah.
of 2019. How did that news impact you? And yeah, how did you hear that news, and how did it kind of sink in?
Yeah. I mean, so I was working in an environment where it was really hectic tech job, basically. Most you hear about these tech companies that are like, oh, they have a $1 billion valuation, which is some milestone they call unicorn status. But um, it was like the day after we had just publicly announced that the two biggest companies in our space were coming together, and our company had bought theirs, but wasn't really the case. And so it's just I had a mid higher up role there at the time, but it was just all like corporate hoopla, I guess. And when you're in a company like that, you are very into the, I guess, the mental cycles of, I'm gonna do anything for this company, and the companies you live, eat and sleep it because you're so committed to climbing the ladder and all this kind of stuff. So I'm just really wrapped up in that. And yeah, I came out of a meeting and, basically was in my office and found out about it. And I think one of the first things that came to mind is I wasn't sure if he had committed suicide. And that was a huge question I had, because it was just like, he's dead. We don't know what from. And yeah, I knew he had like different types of pharmaceuticals at the time. And my sister-in-law is candid about this now, but she was kind of a codependent in that relationship because there was just so much of that floating around. So different
Mhm.
drugs being prescribed. And so it just, you would just, when I got together with him, I would, he had his like military backpack he would carry around, but and I always saw him taking random stuff, but I'm like, I didn't really chastise him on what it was. I was just like, kind of mental noted, oh, there's kind of another thing. But yeah, so I found out about it and I was like, I guess I just got to go home. I need to leave here, left here. And I was actually carpooling with a friend at the time. And it was interesting because um, I just walked into this meeting he was in, and I said, Frank, yeah, like, you got to come with me. You got to go. He's like, what's going on? I'm like, I have a family emergency. And he goes, okay. And he follows me into his office, and I'm like, my brother's dead. We got to go back. We got to go home. And he's just like, okay, goes and grabs his stuff. And I was actually driving. I didn't really ask him to drive, but um, I kind of knew I had to at least keep it together to drive. I didn't want to be going down the road this basket case. But I think up to that point in life, I had I had a certain perception or certain mode of operating that was um, around my emotions and how to handle that. And like, mind you, I got married pretty young. I was 24 and I got married. I started having kids pretty young by today's standards, and I'm the sole breadwinner in my family. So that's a lot of pressure. And so I just developed this kind of shell. And when my brother died, it very much like this, golden hammer hit that shell and made me start really questioning, um, eventually, why I function the way I do, and how I was ever going to process the loss of my brother in a way that was like I knew deep down to be true. Because there was a time when I was songwriting where it was just raw all the time. And because of, life's responsibilities, I again developed that protective shell. And so that set off this certain, of course, chain of events that's like something's got to be done.
Preston, thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead. We'll just take a second.
Yeah.
When you're talking about then the part of finding out, so you shared a little bit then of the shell that you had developed of protection
Hmm.
in your life. So when you found out, then you were still kind of feeling like you had this shell on for a little bit as a guard or a mask or whatever we want to call this armor armor that we sometimes carry, that serves us well at times, right, in order, like you said,
Hmm.
as an mo, as a mode of operation, as the breadwinner, as the parent, as the you know uh, spouse, so that you can kind of keep going and producing and having an income. You sometimes put your emotions on the side.
Hmm.
So you are finding this news, you carpool with your friend, and you were here in Texas at that time, correct?
I was in Washington actually. Yeah.
Oh, you lived in Washington then? Okay.
Hmm. Hmm.
So you're in Washington at that time, and then ho when did you fly that same day back home as California? Um, did you fly back that same day?
Yeah, I think it was like the next day. It was kind of conflicted, right? Because I mean, my brother or my wife knew my brother well. My for my especially my oldest daughter, she knew my brother pretty well. They they didn't see him a ton, but we talked about him, got pictures of him, FaceTimed him, that kind of thing. So I'm kind of conflicted because I'm like, well, my wife and my kids are my priority number one, hands down now. I don't want to like, just abandon them in the middle of this. And so I just kept in touch with my family. And at a certain point, I was talking to my dad. He's like, you need to be down here. You need to come be with us. They were in Southern California in the Palm Springs area. And uh, yeah, I took this horrible connecting flight that got delayed through San Francisco. It dawned on me though, as I take this flight out. My wife had a actually pretty severe panic attack on the way to the airport, uh, where we actually had to pull over on the freeway and like change drivers for the last like 5 minutes of the drive because all this was hitting her that death, and I have to go leave for who knows how long to deal with my brother, and she's got 3 kids that she's got to look after. And but as I was walking through the San Francisco terminal, getting my connecting flight, um, it dawned on me how many people you could just see and no, you have no idea what they're going through, zero clue. And I'm just listening to music, trying to or talking to someone, probably my sister on the phone, you know. So that was kind of a strange realization. But yeah, I went down there and I was there for about a week. But that week was very my parents were, of course, basket case. Even my dad, I probably learned a lot of my emotionality from. He was a wreck. Of course, his wife was, and I went and I had a nice experience with her where I took her out to some hike in Palm Springs, and we just kind of walked around and reminisced about my brother, and then went and found some like high point and prayed over her and the situation. But I still felt like I was not quite being allowed to just be with myself and what I thought, right? Because because this is an unexpected death, and he was 35 when he died, so there's no preparation for those things. What are we going to do with the body? What are we going to do for a memorial? Who do we want there? Do we want anyone there?
Mhm.
All these strange, I'd say
The
business
business,
mode
I
questions.
business, yeah, I
Yeah.
call it, yeah, it's like you're still in that business mode around death. It's like all the, yeah, it doesn't really allow space sometimes for the grief because you're so busy with the calls, the that, making sure that you settle all this, yeah. Yeah, so I can relate to what you're saying, yeah.
It was kind of interesting actually. Of course, there's a lot of people that reach out in the middle of this where they go, well, let me know if there's anything I can do, and some people want to send flowers and things like that. But what unfortunately, so my brother was not great with finances. We ended up finding out that he had a lot of credit card debt, and I'm like, well, and my sister-in-law is working in the beauty industry, which is like a pretty it's not a high paying job. Let's put it that way, right? So she's kind of saddled with all these bills that cropped up, and there's in some cases they'll expunge debt in case of
Mm,
death rather, but in other cases they won't. So there was just a lot of weird stuff there. But at any rate, we started a GoFundMe just to be like, hey, he didn't have a life insurance policy, but we raised $25,000 for her, and that was kind of interesting because I had to sit with her, hear her story, and then I sort of rewrote this narrative version of that for this GoFundMe, and we just shared it. And that was pretty cool to see. I mean, I had a lot of coworkers who donated to it, including the CEO and president of the company I was at, and then um, we there's a lot of family and friends, and that was a really neat thing that came out of it, I guess.
mhm.
In that week, but
Like
yeah,
in lieu of flowers, it's like that $50 that you would get spent on flowers to
yeah,
send them to help uh be able to pay some of these expenses, either of funeral or of debt that someone has left behind. That is huge relief for that family. So
yeah.
that's wonderful that you guys were able to create that for her.
Yeah, it's something I don't think a lot of people realize is that when someone certainly dies unexpectedly and there's not a large money reserve or something. A lot of people have cars, they have car loans. You have a house, you have a mortgage, you have who knows what other expenses
Mhm.
going on. Medical ones are common these days, and how do those get taken care of? I mean,
Mhm.
um, I know one of her family members on her side was, they're calling creditors, and all the creditors are like, we need a death certificate, and so it's just
Mhm.
it's very again, odd business things. You're like, well, how
Mhm.
quickly is the body going to get cremated? And okay, well, I need that death certificate to like settle these debts. what,
Mhm.
what? Just
Mhm.
kind of the most the darkest form of like personal business that you ever really want to have to handle.
Yes.
And so
Yeah,
those
and
things
when you're so
exist.
and when it's so fresh and you're having to deal with this of the having to call, and as you're doing these calls, like having to relive your like having to say that they've passed away, that they've died, and like
Hmm.
reliving your grief in those moments that are so cold. They're not gonna say, "I'm sorry for your loss." Like, they're just like, "Well, when can you get that paper here?" And when, na. It's just
Hmm.
so cold, right? So yeah, that is hard to go through that when you're grieving. So let's shift a little then,
Hmm.
the direction as we're navigating this conversation. And to thank you again for sharing those nuances of all that occurred there. So you did decide, I know based on your documentary, his body was cremated. That was a choice you made then as a family. Um,
Mm.
did you do any type of ceremony or memory memorial around his death? And then from there, we're gonna then jump up to your process of grieving after that with your
Yeah,
art.
so we decided to do a memorial at this church that he had gone to for Celebrate Recovery, which is like a faith based or it's hosted at churches a lot, but it's almost like an NA Alcoholics Anonymous type group, but it's a place he'd gone to a lot for that. And yeah, no open casket. We did he got a military um sort of like kind of ceremonial thing that not
Hmm.
where they shot guns in the air, but this was actually probably the hardest part of the whole thing for me. So I'll say that it's almost like a wedding in some ways. Funerals can be the same, where if you say like open mic night and just say
Mm,
whoever can come up say whatever they want,
mhm,
it can kind of go south really quickly because
mm,
people ramble or they don't know what they want to say or things like that. So kept it very straightforward. And I think there are a couple of my guy cousins. So we had this group of guy cousins that we were all close with growing up. And then his like best friend from high school. They all spoke, which was really cool to hear their stories. And then I did really the eulogy. And that, that was like a 4 or 5 hour process where, I'm just trying to figure out how to summarize these parts of his life for a pretty broad audience, right? I mean,
Mm,
people who've known him, they knew him when he was really young, to high school, to people, in his adult life. But I did that. It was like a 25-minute eulogy, and I used it. I didn't want to sugarcoat it. Um, I think in some ways, when someone dies, at least like this from addiction, it kind of does a disservice if you don't address that elephant in the room.
mhm,
And my sort of message to everyone in the room was like, the tragedy of his death is that it was entirely preventable.
mm,
Um, in that, it's and that we all sort of make these decisions, maybe now, but they can snowball later into something that is deadly. And what is that? I just challenged the audience. I'm like, what is that you have in your life that is a habit that is not going to serve you and could lead to death, and is a decision that you're making every single day? What is that? I don't know, but um and he had quite a few, he had an interesting group of people that he was friends with over time, just because of, his lifestyle and whatnot. And a couple of them would come up to me and they're just like, I'm having all these friends die left and right. I'm like, well, I haven't talked to you in years, but I hope that it's kind of a wake up call. But also, one real quick thing I was going to say about the sort of military uh, service that they did was, so they go and they basically sound off their name and rank, and then they get to him and they call for him, Colin Zeller, staff sergeant, like multiple times, and of course he doesn't say anything because he's not there. And that was like the I'm here, I'm like kind of conducting this whole memorial and like giving a long speech, but that happened. I was like, oh, guy, it's because his military identity and his like passion for that, I think that was the thing he was really most uh, passionate about in life, proud about that service.
mhm,
That was really tough to hear. So um, I think once, so, I spent a week, with my family, came back, and then I think it was maybe like 8 days later, I go back down again for the memorial. And then once that has passed, which I think most people probably find to be the case, it's sort of like, it feels as though that should be this end of something, but it's not at all. And I certainly thought that it might be this end. And then you're just, blindsided by floods of different emotions all the time. And that's essentially what just kept happening and kept happening and kept happening. So I'm like, well, none of this is done.
mhm,
Of course, ultimately you go, well, none of this will ever be, quote, done. But
mhm.
what's gonna help you process these emotions? So that's kind of where I got to.
Dude, that is when that was the aha. Like how many months? So February 2019 he died. What
Mm-hmm.
month did you say, okay, I gotta do something, and that you decided to do it in this visual art project, and we'll go into that. And then the
Mm-hmm.
research, because in your which by the way, with the listeners, when this does get launched in the spring, is correct, it's in the spring of
Yeah,
2023
yeah.
that
It
you
should be
plan on
sometime this
launching it.
spring. Yeah.
Um, you do have experts and so forth talking about grief as well, and you have information and data about the aspect of grief too. So it's a mixture of your own emotion and your own way of dealing with grief of your brother, as well as intertwined with the science of grief per se, the
Mm-hmm.
psychology of grief as well. So when did you decide, okay, this is how I'm going to do it? You had songwriting, you had kind of left that aside for a while, you were now more in the visual arts. So what made you choose to do that?
Yeah, it was about 6 months later that I was doing painting in between that, but I was doing these like bigger pieces, and I did a series of paintings, probably about 9 paintings that were all kind of like this personal depiction of the aftermath of grief, and but it didn't really feel like I was processing the grief as much as I
Mhm.
could have. It just felt like this sort of, well of inspiration. But I j- I noticed a change in myself, and of course I go back to work, and I don't care about any of it. I'm pretty cynical at that point about all the just the politics of people changes and hierarchy, all that kind of stuff, jockeying for positions. But yeah, 6 months later, I I've come up with this project, and oddly enough, I visited Sedona, Arizona.
I love
Right?
Sedona. We've gotten two Thanksgivings we've gotten already there. We love it.
Yeah, it's really pretty. And I'm not really the type that goes and like meditates in a vortex. That's not my bag. But um, we did visit there. Ironically enough, my parents were in like Phoenix area at the time, and I came away from that weekend, and one of the kind of like those decisions was to do this year of painting, and then also make some documentary of it at the time. But I was aware of the 100-day challenge of painting, and I I knew for myself, I'm like I'm a pretty impatient person, so I said I'm gonna come up with this project that's going to be helpful, but also where it's going to challenge me in a variety of areas. One of those being that I'm going to really have to commit to this, but I know at the end of it, hands down, it's going to have made me grow, and I'm not going to have any other expectations beyond that. I don't think. Just that I'm going to go through it, and I'm going to really try to be present with how I operate through it.
So then you started. So then how did you decide then the fact that it was going to be a daily process and that it would end up being a mosaic at the end? Like, was that something in the plan, or did you just mosaic? Is it mosaic or mosaic? Is the S like more like a Z mosaic, like more like
I
a Z?
well, I mean,
I don't know.
I
I'm
say
like, am I
mosaic.
pronouncing it?
If you're from like High England, maybe you say mosaic. I don't
I
know.
don't. I don't. English is
I
hard.
don't, it's
I
but either way.
mosaic. Mosaic, I'll just say it with the mosaic, like, so, or did it just after you had a few of these pieces? Because how big are each of the canvases that you would paint? How big was
They're
each?
8 by 10.
8 by 10 each one. So you
Yeah,
started painting, and what kind of which kind of what you see, I'm not an artist. I'm like
it's
like
okay.
what paint did you do? Acrylic? Did you do what? Like what kind of
Yeah,
materials did you use?
yeah. So to answer the question on the mosaic, I think when I was originally coming up with the size, and I had done some like study pieces on 8 by 10s before, and I just found it to be like a pretty reasonable size. But I I sat down. I'm like, okay, well, I think when I was figuring out that I was going to do this for a year, uh, okay, well, if I do 365 and they're all this, I was doing all the calculations. I'm
You were
like,
like it.
wow. I'm like, it's 202 square feet of painting. So I'm like, well, you could lay that out in a lot of different ways, right? But I think because of my film background, I'm partial to this like 16:9, screen size that
Mm.
um, we all kind of we're all accustomed to now. So, uh, yeah, I knew that was kind of the size it would roughly be, but you know, assembling it and whatnot, I didn't paint them, of course, with any kind of like, oh, I'm painting this thing. The hypothesis for me was that if I'm painting them in an intuitive manner, and they're all coming from me, they're all about a similar subject, that they will make something at the end. So it's kind of a
Mm.
reverse puzzle putting that together. But I experimented with a lot of stuff. I mean, so mostly acrylic paint, different kind of uh, flow, heavy body, medium body, using thickeners. I use actually rubbing alcohol a lot, and that does different things with like breaking apart the pigments. I use an air gun quite a bit as
Mm.
well. I use actually charcoal, and I'll grind up charcoal and do different things with that. Um, and then, of course, the last painting had his ashes in it, which was, partially what inspired what I'm doing now, which is painting these basically grief paintings for other people using
Mm.
ashes at times. So that's
Wow.
partially where I kind of got the idea for that.
So I didn't know that that's what you do. I didn't realize you were doing that now for others. But yes, that part where you were doing that piece because of course I got a preview. I got a preview of the documentary as since I'm interviewing you. But that piece where you're painting that canvas and you're talking about like the pupil of the a little bit right of the it. You had to something regarding the pupil of the eye and so forth as you're drawing this. How did you feel in that moment as you're touching these ashes and this other material that is not paint any at that moment it's
Hmm.
yes you use paint but it's not uh charcoal, it's your brother's what how were the emotions at that point because this is a whole year later than pretty
Hmm.
much this last piece more sorry a whole year later after you started so it'd been probably what a year and a half or so after his passing so what were the emotions that were coming up and did that shell that you had put on for years before of dealing did that shell start kind of shedding little by little as you're drawing painting each of these pieces?
Yeah, well, I'd say certainly each piece or like sets of the pieces were a reflection point. I actually had in front of my screen at the time in my office, I had like a rolling 30 days of every single painting. So
Mm.
I would change them out every single day, and it gave me like this visual progress of what I was doing. And I mean, certainly times where I dealt with anger issues, times where I was maybe more depressive, times where I felt like I was more joyful, times, just kind of that roller coaster of emotion.
Mhm.
And I could see that in the paintings, at least, when I was looking at them. And then the last one, that whole day was kind of bizarre because I was sort of unusually just really exhausted, so much so I took off like practically a half day from work and um, just slept, and then I kind of got. I think the anticipation of doing the last painting
Mm.
was probably pretty emotionally overwhelming, and then I just happened to I had the ashes. I knew I was going to use them, and you know I had never handled ashes before that point. I don't think most of us do, right? Even if you get ashes, they're in a box, and you might look at them once, and then otherwise they're sitting in a box. And so I had them in a mason jar, and I opened it up, and I'm kind of like sifting through these ashes, and it's very bizarre. I mean, especially when you're considering who it is
Mhm.
that you're handling. It's literal physical remains of someone.
Mhm.
Like that is I had been given other items that he owned
Mhm.
from my sister-in-law, and those were kind of like some of them were kind of special. I had like a knife or a shirt or something like that. But then you're like, oh, well, this is him. This is who he was. This is the person I grew up with
Mm.
in a jar. It's a very strange thought, And so I'm like, okay, well, how, you know, perfect this is that, you know, it's I'm putting them sort of back into this like image in my mind of who he, how I looked at him, because you know that the eyes are always, especially when someone has substance abuse issues, you're always looking at their eyes because that's a dead giveaway. You know, are they on something?
Mm.
So I put those, you know, kind of back into his eyes, so to speak, and yeah, that was just a really kind of crazy way to end that series of paintings, but very poetic in a way, because it gave this idea of, you know, what if I did this for other people? And you know, there could really be something there as well. So yeah.
Wow. So how did that okay, so you put the piece together, then how did you had a showing? Was it family, friends? Who came to see your mosaic? And it's huge, and that was a huge task in itself putting that up, and people can see that when they watch the film, but how um how how was it received? Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on people's state of mind when they come see something like this. I've had like a utility worker in here, or like we redid part of our kitchen, and people just stand back and go, "Oh my gosh!" People, and the cool thing is, people who like they don't speak English, right? Like I've had
Mhm,
like
mhm.
a Hispanic worker
Ay,
in here,
Dios
and
mío. Ay, Dios mío.
yeah,
Ay, Dios.
yeah, oh yeah, yeah,
That
yeah,
would be me.
basically that, right?
There you go.
And he just stand like it it there's no telling how it's going to impact people.
Mm,
And I've had people over to my house a bunch of times who are just friends, and you know, they'll sometimes just stand back and stare at it, because
mhm.
it's a lot to look at. I mean, because
It's by
it makes
10
kind of its
it's
own
it's 10 feet
image,
by 20 feet, correct, now as it's hanging, is
right?
that correct? Yeah, 10 by 20, wow.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a lot to take in, and there's of course this light show component to it as well. And we have had some people over who I know have lost somebody, and
Mhm,
they are uh, like, it hits them particularly because they know what it's about. You know, I
mhm,
usually explain to people like, hey, here's what this is. You know, I don't explain it to everyone. Some people have just been like, oh my gosh. People always want to take a picture of it too.
mhm,
They're
mhm.
like, can I take a picture? I'm like, yes, don't post it anywhere. Keep it on your phone. But I think just sharing it has been really cool with people. I mean, my hope is that it will end up somewhere a lot more public than my house,
Mhm,
and really be a true exhibit that people can kind of see and experience. But it's unique at the end of the day, and it's my of course take on, you know, that like first initial really intense period of grieving. But when people, I think, get to understand what it's about, and point out things that you know, small paintings in there that appeal to them, and they'll start dissecting little parts of it. It's just really neat. It's fun to share, and
mhm,
it's sort of so far has really validated that initial hypothesis I had too, of just using art as this visual tool to relate to other people, um, in the grief experience.
mhm. Yeah, normalizing, that's one of your goals now as well, as normalizing this conversation about grief, which is the whole reason behind even this podcast too, is in
Yeah.
normalizing this conversation. So, take us then into how it is people can contact you and be able to have one. First of all, if they did want a commemorative piece done for their loved one, if they wanted to use the ashes, or if there's other ways in which you could do a commemorative piece, and other forms that yeah, like Instagram, we'll put all that information below, but ways in which you're able to aid someone in their process with your art.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the process in and of itself is, people can have ashes or not have ashes, and it doesn't. It's not like a prerequisite. I think part of the point of doing these kinds of paintings, right, is, um, most people are really relegated to like a tombstone, or
Hmm.
they just have the ashes. So it's kind of one or the other. And what what I do is I essentially go through with somebody, and really we dig into like this relationship they had with this person. Um, and it really harkens back to this other thesis I have, that in order to commemorate the memory of a loved one, you need stories of this loved one. You need a strong emotional connection to this person, and then you have basically some kind of something to commemorate them by. And so when we go through this process, we kind of pull out all these emotions and this story they have about this person. And then we go through a process of looking at, previous paintings that I've done. And we kind of like collaborate on the spot of what colors remind them of this person. And that's very specific to them because it's their perception of color. But then techniques that I've done, that's the trippy thing about having all these paintings too, is there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of express that emotion. And then by the end of that, I have this really this sort of template for how I'm going to go and kind of approach the canvas. But the whole point is it's abstract, right? So we're not doing a portrait. We're not doing the house you grew up in.
Hmm.
It's abstract. And what I've found through abstract, right, is it changes over time. It changes over time for how you feel about it and how you look at it. And to me, that's really emblematic of the grief journey. Um, you're not just trying to have this like still snapshot of who the person was or who you are. You're getting, and that's why we get so much information on the person, in their relationship, is you get that, and then I'm sort of like the conduit for translating that into a canvas. Um, and then you have that, and then you can hang that wherever you want in your house. And I usually go and like, where do you want to hang this? But someone could move a painting around wherever they want.
Hmm.
And the beauty of that is you don't have to go visit a gravestone. You don't have to um, just leave these, especially if there's ashes in it. The ashes aren't just sitting there in a box. Let's say you're like, oh, I'm gonna go spread their ashes in some place. There's a lot of ashes after someone dies.
Hmm.
Um, you can use those in different ways, and this could be one of them. But over time, again, the gist is like you have this pain that you can reflect on, and you're gonna see in different ways. So, yeah, and I mostly do that now. People just, I chat with them through Instagram or Facebook. That's the primary way, and then it's becomes a very like one-on-one conversation. So,
It's so beautiful, and it's so interesting to see the direction in which a life just goes when something happens. Like, would you have thought 2.5 years ago that you'd be now? No, 2 years, because he passed away. Wait, 3 years ago, right?
almost 3, yeah.
Almost 3 years in February. So, would you have seen yourself doing this, prior to his passing? You know what I mean? Like,
No.
it took you,
Yeah.
no, at all, right? It's like it took you into a whole other direction and in of your life and these really pivotal moments. So, before we close off, what are some words or something that I might have not asked that you'd still like to share with the audience as we're wrapping up?
Yeah, I mean, I spend a lot of time in like different grief groups and like hashtags and whatnot, and just talking to different people. And so I've kind of, in my mind, noticed some things in the grief process as they feel like patterns. But um, and Lindsay said this well in the documentary, right? Because I mean, she's been in this in a clinical mode for over a decade. But I think people like that have grief and it's going somewhere, and where is it going? Like, how, in what way are you like seeking not just to process it, but kind of understand yourself better? And that's why I kind of have this message at the end of the documentary, which is like, turning grief from this negative thing into being this like, spiritually healing thing of, we don't have like, you don't have to feel as though you're wallowing in darkness the whole time, because it's
Mhm.
like it's going to live with you as long as you're around. But that there's something you do that's proactive, because I think the more anyone who has grief can be proactive about that grief, that's just an encouragement to the next person who goes, hey, I can come out of this and be well. I'm the person's gone, but I know it's not as cut and dry. It's not flipping of a switch, but there's a way we live our lives, I think, that can be helpful for others to see that there's hope there, right? So.
Absolutely. When we were going to start the conversation, and I said, "Wait, let me just start recording because I there was something I wanted to tell you," but I'm like, I just wanted to say it during the interview. And as you're saying this, I want to reflect on this is the fact of time, right? That element of time. That yes, it's been only close to 3 years as we're recording this podcast um, of his passing. Yet, is what did you do with that time and in your grief, and what you said about the grief therapist in the documentary sharing about that, it's really so important is if you take basically some kind of control of your grief of the
Yeah.
what you do in your mourning process. Mourning is like things you can do with it, and grief just happens. So what are you doing to mourn the death of a loved one? And as you're doing that, it will make time kind of grief process kind of shrink and consolidate because you're actually in action mode. And that's what you were doing for the, past year and a half. You were in action mode doing something with your grief. And therefore, these 3 years could seem like it had been 10 of processing a
Mm.
grief journey,
Yeah.
right?
Well, there's this whole idea too that when you're thinking about I'm going to learn a new skill, whatever it
Mm-hmm.
is, which kind of I would think grief kind of falls in that category as well. There's this whole idea that we've all run across people who say, "Oh, I've been doing this for 20 years, whatever it is," and that in and of itself is kind of a crappy barometer,
Yeah.
because
How
you
many
can
hours
do
of those 20 years?
well, that and you could it's the quality, it's like the quality of the practice, right? You could
Yes,
do
yes.
20 years of the first year of practice and you're still stuck in that, going
Mm-hmm.
into the second year of learning something. So just the quality of that practice, what is it? And I would, certainly think the same thing about grief, the quality of that time you're spending about grief. And that's the thing about, when you're just letting time pass and you're just hoping it gets better over time because that's some silly cliche we have, like
Mm-hmm.
you're not, you're in, x number of years of just starting the grief process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So hopefully, you come to that realization that, like, oh gosh, like you said, take control of the grief and in a way that is healthy and suitable
Yes.
for you.
Absolutely, absolutely, because we know already what can happen as well. We've seen and you've experienced it firsthand, what some people can do when they're dealing with grief or trauma in a way that is not conduit to it being healthy, because you had it firsthand with the death of your brother. So
Mhm.
yeah, so definitely taking some little control over the things that we have no control over. We have no control over the death of someone, yet we do
Mhm.
have a little of aspect of control as to how it is we choose to navigate the expression of our grief in certain parts of our life, so that when it does come like a wave tumbling us down, we've already developed some kind of tools as well as to how to navigate it in those moments. So, thank you
Mhm.
so much, Preston. And it's been such a beautiful conversation. We got some moving parts here, and we moved some aspects of my being relating to the death of a sibling, as you were sharing, and I appreciate you being so vulnerable as well, and sharing your heart with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kendra. No, I appreciate the opportunity just to share this. I hope it's helpful for people.
Yes, thank you. And again, we were speaking with Preston Zeller, and his documentary, The Art of Grieving, will be out in the spring. And you can check out the link to how to get a hold of him. But if you are just listening to this, you can find him on Instagram at Preston Zeller, or on his website, theartofgrievingfilm.com, to find out more. Thank you once again. Thank you again so much for choosing to listen today. I hope that you can take away a few nuggets from today's episode that can bring you comfort in your times of grief. If so, it would mean so much to me if you would rate and comment on this episode. And if you feel inspired in some way to share it with someone who may need to hear this, please do so. Also, if you or someone you know has a story of grief and gratitude that should be shared so that others can be inspired as well, please reach out to me. And thanks once again for tuning in to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. Have a beautiful day.